Now that we've covered the basic principles behind modal writing and modal modulation, now we can start looking at other kinds of modes, apart from the Western traditional modes, ethnic scales, artificial scales, and so on. In example 11, I give you a bunch of different examples, 12 of them to be exact, of exotic modes. I'm not going to play all of them now. I'll just play the first 2 or 3 to see how to examine them. But as you can see, there are a lot of them here, and there are also many more that I haven't quoted. And you can also invent your own. So let's look at the first one. It's called Super Lorien. So as we can hear, like the diatonic modes, this one has the same number of notes. It has 7 notes and comes back to the same note at the end, but it has a lot of semitones at the beginning. And after that, it's whole tone. So that gives a very distinctive color to this mode that's rather different from the church modes. The second one, Neapolitan minor, so that's a little bit like a minor scale. A C minor scale would be. But here we have a flat second degree. So that gives the Neapolitan minor a slightly different character of its own. Again, the semitone into the tonic and the semitone between the 5th and 6th degrees give this mode its own character. Here's another one, Neapolitan major. So flats at the beginning, semitone, whole tone, and then whole tone for a while, but with a leading tone at the end. So as you can see, the placement of the semitones in these will give each one a distinctive character. If you want to invent artificial scales, Persichetti has an excellent piece of advice. Let them come from melodic impulse. It's easy to invent abstractions, but it's better if it comes from some kind of musical impulse, and in this case, a melodic one. We've also said before that any of these modes can be made into a family. I could take Super Lorien and start a mode on each degree of the scale, so I'd have the same notes but arranged with different tonics. Okay, so that can be done, and that gives me a family if I want to have a bunch of close modes. If I'm not interested in having modes that are so closely related, I can go into other modes using the same principles of modal modulation we just talked about. If the tonic chord is not a triad, the melody should include the characteristic notes as soon as possible. In other words, in this case, the mode is essentially melodic. Now, let's look at a specific problem that comes up sometimes. Example 12. Here's the mode. As you can hear, this mode has several chromatic steps in it. If I make triads from the 1st, 3rd, and 5th note, then the 2nd, 4th, and 6th, and so on, I get this. The problem with that is those chords are completely inconsistent. They don't give any specific sound. In particular, they're really too varied. And because they're too varied, it makes it very hard to use this kind of mode in a harmonic way. There's too much variety of harmonic material. So this kind of mode is often better being used over a pedal or a drone, or just as a melodic idea. So when you make your mode, or you invent your mode, or you decide to use an existing mode, check the chords first and see what they give you. Do they give you at least some degree of consistency, or are the chords too varied to sound like anything unified? And that will really depend on the intervals within the mode itself. There are also modes that contain less than 7 notes. Look at example 13, 5-note modes. The second one, another 5-note mode. The third one. And the fourth one. Each of these 5-note modes has a different arrangement of tones and semitones, and each one of them, of course, has its own color. It's rather noticeable that the first one, the diatonic one, often called the pentatonic scale, has no semitones at all. So rather like the whole tone scale we talked at the beginning of this lesson, it tends to have a rather static feel. There's no sense of semitone attractions. That kind of static feel can be useful, but it's rarely useful for a very long time. So a mode like that might be useful for fairly short passages or to create a certain character. If you want to use it for a longer time, you'll need to use other aspects of the music to create some kind of variety. That could be timbre, let's say have it appear in different instruments or different orchestrations, different register, different rhythm, but you'll have to do something, because if you keep it in the same rhythm, the same tone color, same tempo, and so forth, it gets boring very fast. Another possibility is to combine a melody in one of these modes with harmony using other things. We'll be coming back to that much later in the course, but not today. There are certain specific modes that are symmetrical. Here's an example, number 14. If you look at it, you'll notice that the first four notes, a whole tone, a semitone, another semitone, are exactly echoed in the last four notes, a whole tone, a semitone, and another semitone. In other words, if I start this mode on C or I start it on F sharp, it's going to give exactly the same group of notes. Okay? Messiaen calls these modes of limited transposition. The symmetry does that. They can give you an interesting harmonic color sometimes, so it's something to be aware of. Shouldn't be used too rigidly, but they can create harmonic colors you wouldn't get in other ways, and they have interesting limits. Another kind of symmetrical mode is the mirror mode. Let's look at example 15. Now this is a little different from the stuff we've looked at up till now, because at this point, the real thing that's happening here is the descending scale that looks to be played in the left hand does the same thing as the ascending scale, the same intervals, but in the other direction, where the upper part goes up a semitone, the lower part goes down a semitone. You'll quickly realize that to use this effectively is going to require hearing both of them at the same time, because otherwise I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of notes with no particular connection between them. In other words, I won't notice the symmetry at all. This kind of mirror harmony we're going to talk more about a little later on in the course, but for now it's just important to notice that some modes can be used in mirror way like this. Again, more details to follow. Another kind of mode that you'll see sometimes is what's called the multi-octave mode. This is a mode which takes up 2 octaves or even more to present all its notes. For example, here's number 16, the first one. So we can hear now that actually I have most of the notes of the chromatic scale in here, but not in the order they're normally in the chromatic scale. It begins and ends on C, although it wouldn't necessarily have to. In this kind of mode, if I put all the notes in the same octave, essentially I'm going to end up with something that's very close to a chromatic scale, which is essentially no mode at all, because all the notes are there. If I keep the notes in their octave positions, I end up with a very specific and strange kind of music. It sounds a little bit like some of Webern, where the notes stay in fixed positions. In other words, let's say A flat always occurs in one specific octave there, because there is no A flat in the lower octave. So if I want to have an A flat, it's got to be not just in any octave, but here. So we're sacrificing what's sometimes called the principle of octave equivalence for a specific color. This is pretty restrictive because it's going to make it very difficult to make chords in anything other than the spacing determined by the mode itself. However, for a short period of time, it can be interesting. We'll listen to another one. This one doesn't even complete in 2 octaves. Here's the second example from example 16. Some of the notes come back in both octaves, but again, to make it audibly effective, you're pretty much going to have to keep the notes in the octaves they appear. It is possible for some notes to appear in more than one octave. For example, the D in this mode appears in the bottom octave and in the second octave, so we can use it in both those places. But some other notes only appear in one place, and those are the only places you can use them. So when using these multi-octave modes, it's important to avoid octaves in the harmony, except for the places where the mode itself has the same note in 2 octaves. So again, as we said before, it makes very severe limits on the spacing.